focus today on 4 of the key findings that I want to highlight to demonstrate what establishing this CO2 transport and storage sector in Scotland could mean for the economy, for the wider UK economy. I think the main points are captured in this slide. So, first of all, our research points to the fact that a new CO2 transport and storage sector in Scotland, which we think would share much of the supply chain structure that oil and gas does now, because instead of taking something out, you're putting something back in, it could bring potential economic gains for Scotland and for the wider UK, both in terms of supporting jobs and generating GDP, which is where all the different incomes in the economy are wrapped in. And as this slide shows, the jobs could be anywhere between 765 in full-time equivalent in the top left, or down to nearly 5,000 down here. In terms of GDP, you could be talking anywhere between 167 million per annum, additional or 486. But the crucial thing is that the size of these economic gains and the size of the prize is determined by a number of factors. And this brings me on to the second key finding, which is I think the biggest challenge that we've got. Policy action and upskilling and labour market participation is going to be crucial if we're going to address persistent skills and worker shortages. And if you want to see the green arrow that we've got going across here, basically our smaller numbers here, that's where we've got a labour supply constraint biting the way that we have now. There's a lot of competition over workers, drives up wages, which will push up prices in the economy. But basically what we've estimated that if we relax these labour supply constraints through policy action and upskilling and labour market participation, here we could go from 765 to over 3,000 jobs, and down here you could go from over 1,200 to nearly 5,000, but I'm going to come on to this bottom case here. So basically we need to develop our capacity so that the labour market can supply what's needed with increased demand, certainly for this, but for the wide range of net zero activities. The key thing here is that if we move down here, when we're going along here, that's just if the Scottish transport and storage sector deals with the emissions that are generated within the Scottish cluster. But we've got potential, and the cluster's already looking at this, that they could ship in CO2 from elsewhere in the world. And so what we found is that if we built out the capacity of the Scottish sector with more investment, so that there's an additional, we're starting out with 7 megatons of CO2 per annum. If we built that out by another 3, this is how your jobs go. Even with the labour supply constraint, you could go from 765 to over 1,200, and here, if you've addressed all your labour supply constraints, your jobs boost could go from 3,000 to 5,000. So there would seem to be a case there that if we can invest in expanding the size of the cluster, developing a new export base for the Scottish economy, we could maximise the jobs and CO2 gains. However, I think we need to think about this within the wider context of the transport and storage developments taking place across the wider UK. Even if the different clusters are not competing in terms of their product about taking the CO2 away, they're likely to be competing over these workers. Basically what I've got here is that if you look at the blue line, that's what happens when we estimate the results we just had for Scotland, if we do that for each of the clusters in turn and we add them together. And that's most likely to be the way that government's going to get estimates, because they're going to ask each of the projects to calculate what they've got. But what we've got in the green lines is when we simulated them simultaneously and they all come on and they start competing for labour. So what you see is at the start, we get more wage pressure in the economy because there's much more competition for workers. Because basically, if with the additive approach, you're overestimating how much GDP and things like that's going to go on, further down the line, the wage pressure spike because of that. So if government wants to get this right, it has to try and think out what's going to happen with all these sectors competing for resources. So there's something that can be done in terms of job creation. We've concentrated in CO2 transport and storage and how they might crowd each other out. What we are now thinking about the Centre for Energy Policy is, what about when all these other net zero activities are coming online? You're doing hydrogen systems, you're doing retrofit for houses, and they're all competing for labour. It makes it more important to do 2 things. One, for us researchers to actually look at them simultaneously to know what the pressures are. But the crucial thing, whatever those pressures are, government needs to act. And they need to coordinate with industry and act on the skills and worker shortages so that you're able to smooth out some of these spikes. Because every time prices go up too much, you're going to dampen what happens to jobs. So action on skills, that's the key thing to stop the spiking.